London, April 15th, 1818. The chandeliers of Lady Harrington's ballroom blazed with 1,000 candles, their light refracting through crystal droplets and casting dancing shadows across the silk-clad assembly below. The spring evening had turned unseasonably warm, and the press of bodies made the air thick with competing perfumes, the sweet heaviness of hothouse roses, and something sharper beneath it all, the acrid scent of nervous perspiration that Clara Pembroke had learned to recognize as the particular fragrance of guilt. She stood at the periphery of the glittering crowd, her deep green gown chosen specifically to blend with the damask wallpaper, her gloved fingers resting lightly on the small reticule that contained her most valuable possession, a leather-bound notebook no larger than her palm. At 30 years old, Clara had perfected the art of invisibility in plain sight, of being present at every significant gathering while seeming to matter to no one, and she watched now with the careful attention of a naturalist observing exotic specimens in their native habitat. Lady Harrington herself swept past without acknowledgement, her coldness a delicious irony given that it was Clara's pen, anonymous and merciless, that had exposed the woman's eldest son's gambling debts 3 months prior. The power of it thrilled through Clara's veins like wine, this secret knowledge that she, penniless and unmarried and utterly dismissed by polite society, held more influence than any of these peacocks suspected. She catalogued the room with practiced efficiency, noting Lord Chamberlain's too frequent visits to the card-room, Fairfax's brittle laughter as her husband paid court to a younger woman, the whispered conference between 2 matrons that suggested fresh scandal brewing. But then the crowd shifted, and her attention snagged on a figure she had never seen before. He stood alone near the terrace doors, tall and severe in black evening clothes that seemed almost austere compared to the peacock display around him, and even from across the room, Clara could sense something different about him, a quality of absolute stillness that made everyone else appear frantic by comparison. His face was all sharp angles and cool assessment, dark hair swept back from a high forehead, and as she watched, he lifted one hand to accept a glass of champagne from a passing footman. She noticed a pale scar across the back of his left hand, the kind of mark that spoke of violence rather than accident. This would be the Duke of Thornhill, just returned from diplomatic service abroad, the man her most recent publication had linked to Lady Westbrook, in terms that had set the ton buzzing for days. Clara felt a small stab of satisfaction at having provoked such interest, though she had to admit the intelligence on this particular story had been thinner than she preferred. But needs must when rent came due, and Aunt Margaret's medicine cost what it did. She studied him now with professional interest, noting how others gave him a wide berth, whether from deference to his rank or something else she could not determine. The Duke's gaze swept the ballroom with what appeared to be profound disinterest, but Clara had spent 2 years learning to read the subtle language of society, and she recognized in his carefully blank expression something more complex, weariness perhaps, or a bone-deep cynicism that matched her own. For a moment, his eyes seemed to pass over her position by the wall, and Clara felt an irrational flutter of alarm, as though he might somehow see through the armor of her anonymity. But then his attention moved on, and she released a breath she had not known she was holding. The musicians struck up a waltz, and Clara watched as Lady Westbrook herself approached the Duke, her beautiful face pale and determined, clearly intent on confronting the rumors that Clara had so carefully planted. And the Duke's response was immediate and startling. He bowed with perfect courtesy, offered his arm, and led the woman onto the dance floor in a public display of support that would do more to quell the gossip than any denial. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The morning light filtered weak and grey through the study window, casting pale rectangles across her father's old desk, where Clara sat surrounded by the evidence of her peculiar profession. It was 10 o'clock on April 16th, 1818, precisely 13 hours since she had stood in Lady Harrington's ballroom cataloguing the sins of her betters, and now in the quiet sanctuary of her modest townhouse, she prepared to transform observation into profit. The study was her favourite room, despite its shabby gentility. The wallpaper faded where sunlight struck it each afternoon, the carpet worn thin near the door, but the window overlooked a small garden where early roses were beginning to bud, and her father's books still lined the shelves in their cracked leather bindings, reminders of a more prosperous time before his death had left her and Aunt Margaret with nothing but debts and diminished prospects. Clara drew a fresh sheet of paper toward her, selected her sharpest pen, and began to write with the fluid confidence of long practice, her script purposefully altered from her natural hand into something more angular and masculine, a precaution she had adopted from the beginning. The words flowed easily because she had refined her formula over 2 years of weekly publication. A careful balance of suggestion and detail that allowed readers to identify her subjects without explicit naming, the art of the scandal sheet requiring enough specificity to titillate while maintaining just enough ambiguity to avoid legal action. She wrote now of the Duke of Thornhill, of his late arrival at Lady Harrington's ball and his conspicuous attention to Lady Westbrook, and though Clara's actual intelligence on this matter was thin, based merely on second-hand gossip from a maid who claimed to have seen a tall gentleman leaving Lady Westbrook's residence near midnight the 3 days prior, she embroidered the facts with confident insinuation because rent was due in a fortnight, and Aunt Margaret's laudanum cost more each month as her pain increased. The small voice of conscience that sometimes whispered during these morning sessions made itself heard now, questioning whether she truly knew enough to publish such claims about a man recently returned from diplomatic service. But Clara silenced it with practiced efficiency by calculating the sum Mr. Whitmore would pay for this edition and comparing it against the mounting household expenses. Her pen scratched steadily across the page as she shaped the Duke into a figure of mysterious intrigue, suggesting that his years abroad had perhaps schooled him in discretion, but not in virtue, that his apparent coldness might mask warmer inclinations, that Lady Westbrook's pale face at recent gatherings might indicate more than seasonal illness. She was just signing her nom de plume, The Whisperer, with its characteristic flourish when she heard Aunt Margaret's slow footsteps in the hallway, and Clara quickly blotted the page and slipped it beneath her household accounts ledger. Her aunt appeared in the doorway, a fragile woman of 55, whose once beautiful face had been carved into new geography by pain and laudanum, and she smiled with the vague sweetness that indicated she had already taken her morning dose. "Clara, dear, you have been working on the account since breakfast. Surely you need some air," her aunt said, and Clara felt the familiar twist of guilt and love and resentment that characterized all their interactions. Guilt that she could not provide better care, love for this woman who had taken her in without question when her father died, resentment at the burden that made her work necessary. She promised to walk in the garden later and watched her aunt drift away before retrieving her manuscript and reading it through with a critical eye, noting with satisfaction that she had captured exactly the right tone of knowing suggestion. By noon she had made a fair copy and sealed it, and at 2 o'clock she delivered it personally to Mr. Whitmore's print shop in a narrow street near Cheapside, where the printer accepted her pages and her instructions without question because he had learned long ago that the Whisperer paid promptly and generated sales that made curiosity unprofitable. Wednesday's publication, he confirmed, counting out her payment for the previous week's edition, and Clara left with the coins heavy in her reticule and the uneasy knowledge that she had just set something in motion that might prove more consequential than she intended. The rain began just as Clara settled into the corner table at Gunther's tea shop on the afternoon of April 17th, 1818, a soft pattering against the windows that promised to become something more substantial, and she felt a peculiar satisfaction in the timing because rain always made people linger over tea and loosen their tongues with gossip. Harriet Langley sat across from her, her only real friend in a world where Clara had deliberately cultivated distance, and Harriet chattered pleasantly about her children while Clara made appropriate responses and listened with half her attention to the conversation swirling around them in the crowded room. The Whisperer's latest edition had circulated yesterday, and Clara could feel its effects rippling through society, like stones thrown into still water, the sideways glances and hushed conferences that indicated her words had found their mark. She lifted her teacup with steady fingers and allowed herself a moment of private triumph, wondering what these women would say if they knew that the plain Miss Pembroke, in her modest lavender gown, held more power over their reputations than their wealth or beauty could ever purchase. But then the door opened, and Lady Westbrook entered with her companion, and Clara's satisfaction curdled into something uncomfortable. The woman looked genuinely ill, her beautiful face pale and drawn, her eyes red-rimmed in a way that suggested she had been weeping. And when she sat at a nearby table, Clara could not help but overhear fragments of her conversation with Mrs. Fairfax. "It is entirely false," Lady Westbrook said, her voice tight with distress. "The Duke has been nothing but courteous. He came to my home at my husband's invitation to discuss a diplomatic matter. My husband was present the entire time, but now these vile insinuations threaten to destroy my reputation, and I do not even know who to confront because this Whisperer is a coward who hides behind anonymity." Clara felt her face grow warm and took a long sip of tea to cover her reaction, reminding herself that Lady Westbrook was a wealthy woman with a devoted husband and every advantage in life, that one small scandal would barely touch her in the long term, that Clara's own survival depended on these publications. But the woman's genuine distress was harder to dismiss than she had anticipated. Harriet was saying something about the scandal, and Clara forced herself to focus, trying to appear casually interested rather than intensely invested, and Harriet obliged with details gleaned from her own sources. "They say the Duke of Thornhill is absolutely furious about the story," Harriet reported with relish. "He has apparently demanded a meeting with Lady Westbrook to clear her name publicly, and someone told me he has a reputation from his diplomatic service for being absolutely brilliant at uncovering deception, the kind of man who can look at a situation and see patterns that no one else notices." Clara felt a small flutter of unease in her chest, but suppressed it because surely no amount of intelligence could pierce the careful anonymity she had constructed over 2 years of cautious practice. The rain intensified against the windows, and through the glass, Clara watched the street become a river of mud and puddles, and she thought about the Duke's face at the ball, that quality of absolute focus and cool assessment, and wondered for the first time whether she might have chosen the wrong target for her pen. The heavy knock at the front door came at 6 o'clock on the evening of April 18th, 1818, just as the rain that had threatened all day finally arrived in earnest. And Clara felt her stomach drop even before their aging housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, shuffled past the parlor to answer it, because respectable callers did not arrive unannounced at this hour and in this weather. She set down her teacup with studied calm and reminded herself that Aunt Margaret was safely away visiting the Fairfax family for the evening, that whatever this interruption portended, she would face it alone without risk of exposing her aunt to unpleasantness. But then Mrs. Davies appeared in the doorway with confusion written across her weathered face, and announced that the Duke of Thornhill requested an audience with Miss Pembroke on a matter of some urgency. Clara's mind went perfectly blank for 3 seconds, while her heart hammered against her ribs, and then training took over, and she heard herself say with creditable composure that she would of course receive His Grace, and watched Mrs. Davies withdraw to show him in. He entered the modest parlour like a storm given human form, all controlled power and focused intensity, water darkening the shoulders of his greatcoat, and his dark hair slightly disordered by wind, and Clara rose from her chair because her legs somehow still functioned, despite the terror coursing through her veins. "Your Grace," she said, "this is most unexpected." And he replied, "Miss Pembroke, I apologize for the irregularity of this call, but the matter cannot wait." And his voice was deep and steady and contained no anger at all, which somehow frightened her more than rage would have done. She gestured to the chair opposite hers with a hand that did not quite tremble, and offered tea with automatic politeness, but he remained standing and said, "I think we can dispense with the social niceties, Miss Pembroke, as I believe you know why I am here." She forced herself to meet his eyes, those grey eyes that had seemed merely cold at Lady Harrington's ball, but now appeared sharp enough to cut through every defence she possessed, and said, "I cannot imagine what business the Duke of Thornhill might have with me. We have never been introduced." He smiled then, a thin expression without warmth, and drew from his coat pocket a folded news sheet, which she recognized with sinking certainty as the latest edition of The Whisperer. "I have spent the past 24 hours conducting a rather interesting investigation," he said, his tone conversational as though they discussed the weather, "and I have discovered several fascinating connections that I thought you might wish to discuss." Clara kept her expression carefully neutral and replied, "I am afraid I do not take your meaning," and he said, "Then allow me to be more clear," and proceeded with methodical precision to dismantle every protection she had built over 2 years of careful anonymity. He spoke of linguistic patterns he had identified in her scandal sheet, specific phrases and constructions that appeared also in a letter she had written 3 years ago to a charitable subscription that he had obtained from their records, the distinctive rhythm of her sentences and her particular choices of metaphor. He mentioned the timing of her father's death, and the subsequent first publication of The Whisperer, exactly 6 weeks later when her financial distress would have become acute, the correlation between stories published and her documented presence at specific social events, the fact that Mr. Whitmore the printer had been seen accepting delivery of manuscripts from a woman matching her description on precisely the schedule The Whisperer maintained. He noted that she had been observed at Lady Harrington's ball, watching him specifically during the brief period he had spoken with Lord Carstairs near the refreshment table, the same period that had been referenced with suspicious accuracy in the false story about Lady Westbrook. With each detail, Clara felt her defences crumble further until she stood exposed before him, and when he finally fell silent, the only sound was rain lashing the windows and her own rapid breathing. She considered denying everything, but recognized the futility in his steady gaze, considered fleeing, but knew she was trapped as surely as if he had locked the door, and instead she lifted her chin and said, "Very well, Your Grace. You have been remarkably thorough. What is it you want from me?" The silence between them stretched for several heartbeats after Clara posed her question, and Alexander finally moved to sit in the chair opposite hers, his movements deliberate and controlled, as though he had carefully considered each action. And when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier hardness and taken on a quality of weary determination. "I want your help, Miss Pembroke," he said, "and I am prepared to offer you both protection and compensation in exchange for it. But first I must ask you to listen to something that very few people know, and which I would not share except that circumstances leave me no choice." Clara felt her fear recede slightly in the face of her curiosity, and she sat down as well, acutely aware that the tea service between them had gone cold, and that the rain outside had intensified until it created a strange intimacy in the small parlour, sealing them away from the world beyond. She watched him carefully, noting the way his jaw tightened before he continued, the way his left hand, with its distinctive scar, flexed once against his knee as though bracing for pain. 2 years ago in Vienna, he said, my younger sister Sophia was killed when the carriage she was traveling in was attacked on a road outside the city, and the official report stated that it was a robbery gone wrong. But I have reason to believe that it was an assassination intended for me that took her life instead. Clara felt genuine shock ripple through her and said, without thinking, I am deeply sorry for your loss, Your Grace, and meant it with a sincerity that surprised her, and he acknowledged her words with a slight nod before pressing on. I was serving in a diplomatic capacity at the time, he explained, negotiating certain sensitive matters between Britain and several continental powers, and I had discovered evidence that information from our delegation was being leaked to French agents, intelligence that was costing lives and compromising our negotiations. But before I could identify the source, there was an incident at an embassy reception and I was injured, and he gestured to the scar on his hand, and while I was recovering, someone gave Sophia my schedule and sent her in a carriage they told her I would be taking, and she died in the attack meant for me. The anguish beneath his controlled words was unmistakable, and Clara found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn by the genuine emotion in a man who had seemed so coldly analytical only moments before. When I returned to London 3 days ago, he continued, I came with evidence that the conspiracy did not end in Vienna, that someone in London society is continuing to pass intelligence to French agents, and that they are using an ingenious method to hide their communications in plain sight within the constant stream of gossip and scandal that circulates through the ton. Clara's mind immediately began racing through the implications, her writer's instinct for pattern and connection engaging despite her fear. And she said slowly, You believe they are embedding coded information in gossip, that someone is using the same channels I use for my scandal sheet. And he replied, More than that, Miss Pembroke. I believe someone may have been using your scandal sheet itself, publishing stories with specific details that serve as signals or intelligence drops for their network. She felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her and said, That is impossible. I write every word myself. No one has access to my manuscripts before publication. But even as she spoke, she was remembering odd moments over the past months, stories that had appeared with slight variations from what she had written, details she had attributed to printer errors or her own faulty memory. Alexander leaned forward, his grey eyes intent on her face, and said, I need someone who understands how information flows through society, who knows the patterns of gossip and scandal, who can help me trace these communications back to their source before more people die. And you, Miss Pembroke, are the only person in London with both the knowledge I require and reason to help me, because if this conspiracy is discovered and your connection to the Whisperer becomes public knowledge in the investigation, your life as you know it will be destroyed. But if you help me stop it, I will ensure your identity remains protected, and I will pay you enough that you need never write another scandal sheet again. Clara sat very still, her notebook visible on the side table beside her, where he had certainly noticed it, her mind weighing survival against principle, and finding that principle was a luxury she could not afford. And finally she said, If I agree to help you, Your Grace, I need your word that my aunt will be protected from any scandal or danger. And he replied without hesitation, You have it, Miss Pembroke. And for the first time since he had entered her parlour, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps they both might survive what was coming. Clara arrived at Alexander's London residence at precisely 2 o'clock on the afternoon of April 22nd, 1818, 4 days after their tense agreement in her parlour, and felt her nervousness intensify as Morrison the butler, a man whose military bearing and watchful eyes suggested he was far more than a simple servant, showed her through the grand entrance hall and up the stairs to the Duke's private study on the 2nd floor. The room she entered was everything her modest townhouse was not, spacious and lined floor to ceiling with books in leather bindings, great windows admitting the spring sunshine that had finally broken through days of rain, and a massive desk covered not with the usual aristocratic clutter, but with maps of Europe, stacks of diplomatic papers, and what appeared to be coded correspondence in several languages. Alexander rose from his chair as she entered, and she noticed that here in his own domain he seemed somehow more substantial, less the cold figure from the ballroom, and more a man in his natural element. And when he said, "Miss Pembroke, thank you for coming. I realize this situation is highly irregular," his voice carried a warmth that had been absent during their first encounter. She replied that irregular had become rather routine in recent days, and was rewarded with a slight smile that transformed his austere features into something almost approachable, and then they settled into the work that had brought them together. Clara taking the chair he offered beside the desk, while he spread before her copies of every edition of The Whisperer from the past 6 months. For the next hour they worked in focused silence, broken only by occasional questions or observations, Clara reading through her own words with new eyes, while Alexander Cross referenced each scandal sheet against a timeline of diplomatic incidents he had compiled, and gradually a pattern began to emerge that sent cold understanding down her spine. Certain stories, ones she remembered writing but which contained details she had not included, appeared exactly 2 days before intelligence leaks in Vienna or Paris or Brussels, and the additional details were always seemingly insignificant things, the color of a lady's gown, or the number of guests at a party, or specific flowers mentioned in a garden. But when Alexander showed her how these details corresponded to a cipher based on flower language and numerical codes, she felt as though she were seeing a completely different text hidden within her own work. Someone had been altering her manuscripts after she delivered them to Mr. Whitmore, but before publication, adding these small details that would be invisible to any reader except those who knew to look for them, and Clara felt violated and furious that her words had been used for such purposes without her knowledge. She looked up from the papers to find Alexander watching her with an expression that held both sympathy and something else she could not quite name. And he said quietly, "Your knowledge of these people and their connections is invaluable, Miss Pembroke. I have spent 4 days attempting to identify who might have access to your manuscripts, and I confess I am at an impasse, but you understand the social dynamics in ways I cannot." Clara felt a flush of pleasure at his words, at being valued for her mind rather than dismissed as so many in society had dismissed her, and as they continued working through the afternoon, the light shifting across the desk and their discussion becoming more animated as they identified 3 possible suspects who had both social access and potential motive, she caught herself smiling at one of his dry observations about Lord Pemberton's legendary stupidity making him an unlikely master spy, and he smiled back with genuine amusement, and for a moment the tension between them eased into something that felt almost like friendship. By the time Morrison knocked to announce it was past 6 o'clock, and perhaps Miss Pembroke required refreshment, Clara's fingers were stained with ink from taking notes, and Alexander had noticed this detail, his gaze lingering on her hands with an expression she might have called charmed, if such a word could apply to a duke. And when she rose to leave with their list of suspects and plans to investigate further, she realized that somewhere in those 4 hours she had stopped being quite so afraid of him, and had started being afraid of something else entirely. The evening of April 25th, 1818, found Clara standing beneath the illuminated arches of Vauxhall Gardens at precisely 8 o'clock. Wearing a silver mask that concealed the upper half of her face and a gown of deep blue silk that she had borrowed from Harriet with trembling hands and weak justifications about needing to observe society for her writing, and though the masquerade offered the promise of anonymity, and the gardens were crowded with revelers in fantastic costumes, Clara felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with society's judgment, and everything to do with the tall figure in a simple black domino who materialized beside her with the quiet intensity she had come to recognize as distinctly Alexander's. He looked different tonight, dressed more casually than she had ever seen him, the formality of his usual attire replaced by our clothing that allowed him to blend into the shadows, and when he said softly, "Miss Pembroke, you look well," she felt warmth rise in her cheeks and was grateful for the mask that hid her reaction. They had come to observe Lord Carstairs, one of their 3 remaining suspects, who was known to frequent Vauxhall and whose financial difficulties made him a plausible target for French recruitment. And as they moved through the crowds, keeping a careful distance from their quarry, Clara found herself hyper-aware of Alexander's presence beside her, the way his hand occasionally touched her elbow to guide her through the press of bodies, the protective way he positioned himself between her and the rougher elements of the crowd. The gardens were ablaze with colored lanterns strung through the trees, and the sounds of music and laughter filled the air. And under other circumstances, Clara might have found the scene romantic. But tonight, every sense was focused on the grey-haired man 20 paces ahead of them, who had just turned down one of the darker walking paths away from the main pavilion. Alexander leaned close to murmur, "Stay behind me," and Clara felt his breath against her ear and had to force herself to concentrate on the investigation rather than the sudden racing of her heart. And together they followed Carstairs down the shadowed path until he stopped in a secluded alcove where another figure waited, a man Clara did not recognize, who handed Carstairs what appeared to be a letter. She shifted position to see better, and her foot caught on an exposed root, and in the instant before she fell, Alexander's arm came around her waist and pulled her back against him into the shelter of a flowering hedge, his other hand rising to cover her mouth gently to silence her gasp of surprise. And they stood frozen together as the 2 men not 10 feet away completed their exchange, and Carstairs took out a tinderbox and began to burn the letter he had just received, letting the ashes fall to the ground. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, and she was intensely conscious of every point where Alexander's body touched hers, the solid strength of his chest against her back, the careful way his hand remained over her mouth, though she had made no sound, the protective tension in his frame as he watched the 2 men separate and disappear down different paths. And when the footsteps had faded and the 9 o'clock fireworks began to explode overhead in cascades of colored light, Alexander finally released her and turned her to face him, his hands on her shoulders, and said with raw urgency, "Clara, are you hurt?" And she registered distantly that it was the first time he had used her given name, his grey eyes behind the mask, searching her face with an intensity that had nothing to do with their investigation, and everything to do with genuine fear for her safety. She managed to shake her head and whispered that she was perfectly well, and then, without discussing it, they both dropped to their knees beside the spot where Carstairs had burned the letter, Alexander producing a handkerchief to gather the ashes, while Clara used her gloved fingers to sift through the remains. And there among the black fragments was a corner of paper that had escaped the flames, charred at the edges, but still bearing 3 words in an elegant hand that made Alexander's breath catch audibly when she held it up to the light of the fireworks overhead. And those words were, "Sinclair confirms Thursday next," and Clara felt triumph and terror surge through her in equal measure as she realized they had found their proof and that the danger was now infinitely more real than it had been when this was merely theory and supposition. The morning of April 26, 1818, found Clara alone in her study at 11 o'clock. 11 hours since Alexander had handed her into his carriage outside Vauxhall Gardens, with a lingering pressure of his fingers against hers, and a low-voiced instruction to rest well that had made sleep entirely impossible. And now she sat at her father's old desk, staring at the charred fragment of letter they had recovered. The words "Sinclair confirms Thursday next," seeming to burn themselves into her vision, even as her mind insisted on replaying every moment of the previous evening with mortifying clarity. The weight of Alexander's arm around her waist, the careful way his hand had covered her mouth, the raw urgency in his voice when he had called her Clara for the first time. These sensations haunted her with an intensity that felt dangerous and foolish in equal measure, and Clara recognized with sinking certainty that she had committed the cardinal sin of allowing herself to develop feelings for a man so far above her station that the very idea of anything beyond their temporary partnership was laughable. She forced herself to turn away from such thoughts and toward the investigation, spreading before her the network of contacts and sources she had cultivated over 2 years of writing The Whisperer, and began systematically researching everything she could discover about Alexander Beaumont, Duke of Thornhill, telling herself this was merely professional thoroughness, even as her heart hammered with each new detail she uncovered. Through discreet inquiries to her most reliable gossips, through old letters and society pages she had saved, through the memories of those who had known him before Vienna, Clara pieced together a portrait that made her chest ache with understanding and resignation. His sister Sophia had been only 19 when she died, caught in an explosion at the British Embassy that Alexander himself had survived by mere chance of being in another room. And the guilt and grief had transformed him from a man known for warmth and easy charm into the cold, distant figure who had returned to London. But there was more, whispered to Clara by Lady Pemberton, who remembered everything and loved to share it, that Alexander had been engaged 3 years ago to a woman named Elizabeth Hartley, a match based on genuine affection, until he had broken the engagement abruptly just before accepting his diplomatic post, and the rumors suggested he had done so specifically to protect her from the dangers of his work after threats had been made against those close to him. Clara sat back in her chair as understanding washed over her cold and complete, realizing that Alexander had deliberately chosen isolation over love, had sacrificed his own happiness to keep others safe, and would certainly never allow himself to care for someone he had placed directly in danger through this investigation. The knock at her study door made her start, and Aunt Margaret entered with her gentle, worried expression, commenting that Clara seemed terribly distracted these past days, and had she noticed that Mr. Whitmore had sent a rather urgent note about the missing scandal sheet that should have been published yesterday, and Clara felt a strange detachment as she realized she had entirely forgotten her weekly deadline for the first time in 2 years, so consumed had she been with Alexander and conspiracies and feelings she had no right to harbor. Outside her window, the weather had shifted again, fog rolling in from the Thames thick and grey, and Clara pulled the charred letter fragment closer and made herself a promise that she would guard her heart carefully, would see this investigation through with professionalism and competence, and would not make the mistake of imagining that the concern she saw in Alexander's grey eyes was anything more than the decent worry of one partner for another, because men like the Duke of Thornhill did not fall in love with women like her, women who lived by their wits and their pens in modest townhouses with delicate aunts, and to believe otherwise would be to invite a heartbreak far more devastating than any scandal she had ever written. The afternoon of April 28th, 1818, found Clara in the Egyptian Gallery of the British Museum at precisely 4 o'clock. Surrounded by ancient artifacts and the hushed atmosphere of scholarly contemplation as she bent over a reference volume on historical ciphers, having convinced herself that researching methods of coded communication was purely professional necessity and had nothing whatsoever to do with avoiding her own thoughts about grey eyes and protective arms and the way her name had sounded in Alexander's voice at Vauxhall Gardens. She had dressed carefully in a simple walking dress of brown merino wool that she told herself was chosen for practicality rather than the secret hope that she might appear studious and serious, and her hair was pinned severely back in a style that emphasized her determination to approach this investigation with renewed focus and absolutely no emotional entanglement, though her heart seemed to have other ideas and insisted on racing every time she recalled the warmth of his hand covering hers in the carriage. The museum was quiet at this hour, with only a handful of other visitors wandering among the glass cases, displaying artifacts from distant lands and vanished civilizations, and Clara found comfort in the presence of these ancient things that had survived millennia and cared nothing for the complications of human hearts or the impossible gulf between scandal sheet writers and dukes. She was so absorbed in a passage about substitution ciphers used during the Roman Empire that she did not hear footsteps approaching until a familiar voice said quietly, "Miss Pembroke," and she looked up so quickly that she nearly knocked over the heavy volume to find Alexander standing beside her display case, looking slightly uncertain in a way she had never seen before, dressed in a coat of dark blue superfine and carrying what appeared to be additional research materials, and the genuine pleasure that lit his features when their eyes met made something in her chest constrict painfully. He explained with an honesty that seemed to cost him something that Morrison had mentioned seeing her enter the museum, and Alexander had hoped he might find her here, as he had information about another diplomatic incident that had occurred just yesterday, involving a leak of shipping routes to French privateers, and Clara understood with sudden clarity that this was not entirely chance, but rather a deliberate seeking out, and the knowledge made her feel simultaneously alarmed and inexplicably hopeful. They moved to a wooden bench beneath a massive stone pharaoh, and sat with careful space between them as Alexander described the latest intelligence failure. But then somehow the conversation shifted, and he was telling her about visiting this very gallery as a boy, with his mother who had been a passionate student of ancient languages and had filled his childhood with stories of lost civilizations and forgotten wisdom. And Clara found herself sharing her own love of antiquities inherited from her scholar father, who had believed that understanding the past was essential to navigating the present. The afternoon light slanted through the tall windows and turned the dust motes to gold between them. And for the first time since this partnership began, they simply talked without the weight of conspiracy or investigation, discovering shared fascinations and similar griefs. And when a comfortable silence fell, Alexander did not rush to fill it, but simply sat beside her, looking at the carved hieroglyphs on the sarcophagus across from them, and Clara realized that she had never in her life felt so upset and so understood by another person. Eventually, Alexander said quietly that they should attend Lady Ashford's soiree tomorrow evening, as all their remaining suspects would be present, and time was growing dangerously short, and Clara agreed with an outward composure that concealed her awareness that every moment in his company was making it harder to protect her heart. And as they rose to leave, he mentioned almost casually that he had noticed she had not published The Whisperer in 2 weeks, and hoped that was not causing her financial difficulty, as he would be happy to advance her payment. And the thoughtfulness of his concern, combined with his careful avoidance of judgment about her circumstances, made Clara want to weep with gratitude and frustration in equal measure, because how was she supposed to guard herself against falling completely in love with a man who noticed such things and cared enough to mention them? The evening of April 29th, 1818, found Clara standing in Lady Ashford's overcrowded drawing room at precisely 10 o'clock, wearing the deep green silk gown she had worn to Lady Harrington's ball 14 days earlier. The choice a deliberate reminder to herself of who she had been before Alexander Beaumont had appeared in her parlour and turned her orderly if lonely world into something infinitely more complicated and dangerous, and she pressed herself against the wall near the potted palms, trying to appear unremarkable, while her mind worked with desperate intensity to make sense of the fragments they had gathered over weeks of investigation. Alexander stood across the room, engaged in conversation with Lord Pemberton, his posture relaxed and his expression one of polite boredom, but Clara had learned to read the tension in his shoulders, and the way his left hand flexed slightly when he was concentrating, and she knew he was as alert as she to every conversation and movement in this gathering, where all three of their remaining suspects were present, along with half of fashionable London. Lady Catherine Sinclair moved through the crowd with the ease of someone entirely comfortable in society, her pale blue gown and sapphire jewelry marking her as a woman of considerable wealth and impeccable taste. And she was the hostess's younger sister, which meant she had helped plan this evening and knew precisely who would attend, a detail that suddenly struck Clara as significant in ways she could not yet articulate. She had spent the past hour drifting from group to group, listening to gossip about the Earl of Westbrook's gambling debts and speculation about whether Miss Hartley would finally accept Mr. Davidson's suit down, standard society chatter that meant nothing except. Clara's trained ear had begun to notice something strange in the rhythm of certain conversations, the way particular phrases seemed to echo across different groups as though someone were deliberately seeding specific information into the social atmosphere. Alexander caught her eye and made the smallest gesture toward the refreshment table, and Clara moved in that direction with careful casualness, arriving just as he did, and accepting the glass of lemonade he offered, while he said quietly that Lord Carstairs had been cleared by the Foreign Office after surveillance revealed him meeting with his banker about investments, which meant their list of suspects had narrowed to Lady Sinclair and Mrs. Whitmore, and Clara felt her thoughts suddenly crystallize with the sharp clarity that always accompanied her best insights as she realized what she had been seeing. She turned to Alexander and said in an urgent undertone that the scandal sheet itself was the mechanism, that someone had been imitating her writing style and embedding coded messages within gossip items, using flower language and specific word patterns that would mean nothing to casual readers but everything to French agents who knew how to decode them, and she watched comprehension dawn in his grey eyes as he understood that her anonymous publication had been compromised and weaponized without her knowledge. They stood frozen for a moment in shared realization, and then Clara's gaze swept the room and landed on Lady Catherine Sinclair, who was watching them with an expression of cold assessment that made Clara's blood turn to ice, and Alexander's hand found hers behind the concealment of her skirts and squeezed once in warning or reassurance, or perhaps both, as Lady Sinclair began moving deliberately in their direction with a smile that did not reach her calculating eyes. And Clara understood with absolute certainty that they had found their traitor, and worse, that she had just realized they knew. The clock in Alexander's study struck midnight on April the 30th. 1818, as Clara stood before his massive mahogany desk, still wearing her green silk gown and feeling her heart race with the exhilaration of their discovery and the sharp edge of fear that came with knowing Lady Catherine Sinclair had recognized their awareness, and she watched Alexander pace before the fire with barely controlled energy, while Morrison, his ex-military butler, poured brandy into crystal glasses with hands that showed the steadiness of a man accustomed to crisis, and the impropriety of her presence here at this scandalous hour meant nothing against the urgency of what they had uncovered. Alexander turned to her with grey eyes that held both fierce intelligence and something darker that made her breath catch. And he said with careful control that they needed to create a fabricated scandal sheet containing false intelligence that would lure Lady Sinclair into revealing herself and her French contacts. But his voice shifted as he continued that Clara's part in this was finished, and he would have Morrison deliver the document while she remained safely out of danger. And Clara felt fury ignite in her chest at this casual dismissal after weeks of partnership. She set down her untouched brandy with enough force to make the glass ring, and said with icy precision that she had not spent 14 days risking everything to be set aside like a child when the actual danger began, that her scandal sheet and her writing style were the very foundation of this trap, and no one else could craft it convincingly enough to fool a woman who had been studying and imitating her work for months. And Alexander's jaw tightened as he argued that Lady Sinclair knew Clara's identity now and would not hesitate to expose or harm her. And did she not understand that her Aunt Margaret would be left alone and unprotected if something happened? The argument escalated, with Clara demanding to be treated as an equal partner rather than a liability to be managed, and Alexander's careful control finally cracking as he said with raw intensity that he could not bear to risk her, that Sophia had died because he failed to protect her from the consequences of his diplomatic work, and he would not survive losing someone else he cared for, and the words hung in the air between them like a confession neither had intended. Clara stood frozen as understanding crashed over her that this protective fury was not condescension, but fear born of feeling, and she saw in his face the same terrified longing she had been fighting in herself. And when she said quietly that she was not Sophia and this was her choice to make, Alexander closed the distance between them and caught her hands in his, the scar on his left hand pale against her ink-stained fingers. They stood in the firelight with the storm building outside and rain beginning to strike the windows, and he said hoarsely that they would do this together, but she must promise to follow his lead if danger became immediate. And Clara agreed because she understood this compromise cost him dearly, and because the intensity in his eyes made it impossible to refuse him anything. And when Morrison discreetly mentioned that a letter had arrived from the Foreign Office marked urgent, they broke apart and turned to the practicalities of planning a trap that would unfold in 3 days on May 3rd. And Clara left at 2 o'clock in Alexander's carriage, with rain soaking the London streets, and the knowledge that whatever happened next, nothing between them would ever be simple again. The morning of May 2nd, 1818 dawned grey and cold at 7 o'clock as Clara sat at her father's old desk with the fabricated scandal sheet spread before her, the carefully crafted sentences designed to lure Lady Catherine Sinclair into revealing herself and her network of French contacts, and her ink-stained fingers trembled slightly as she read through the coded intelligence one final time, knowing that tomorrow night everything would come to a crisis point that could end in triumph or disaster for them both. She had spent 18 days in Alexander's orbit since he appeared in her parlour with his evidence and his impossible proposition, and in that time her carefully constructed world of anonymity and cynical observation had been torn apart and rebuilt into something she could not yet name, something that terrified her with its intensity and its fragility, and she understood with painful clarity that solving this conspiracy would mean the end of their partnership and quite possibly the end of whatever strange understanding had grown between them. The sound of a carriage in the street made her heart leap, but it passed by, and she felt foolish for hoping Alexander would come when they had agreed to maintain distance until tomorrow's trap was sprung. But then Aunt Margaret appeared in the doorway with her delicate features drawn with concern to say that the Duke of Thornhill was below asking to speak with Clara on a matter of urgent business, and Clara felt her pulse accelerate as she descended the stairs to find Alexander standing in her modest front parlour, looking as though he had not slept, his cravat slightly loosened, and his grey eyes holding an expression she could not decipher. He turned as she entered, and said without preamble that the Foreign Office had moved up the timeline, and they must execute the trap tonight instead of tomorrow. That Lady Sinclair had been observed preparing to leave London, which meant she suspected their awareness, and was fleeing before they could act, and Clara felt the careful plans they had constructed over days suddenly collapse into frantic improvisation, as Alexander explained that Morrison had already delivered the false scandal sheet to their arranged contact point, and now they must be in position at the abandoned warehouse near the docks by 9 o'clock that evening to intercept whatever meeting occurred. She agreed immediately, despite the fear that clawed at her throat, because there was no other choice, and because she could see in Alexander's face the same desperate determination she felt. and when he caught her hand and said with quiet intensity that she must promise to stay hidden no matter what transpired, and let him and Morrison handle any confrontation, Clara found herself agreeing, not because she believed she would keep that promise, but because the look in his eyes made it impossible to refuse him anything, and she understood in that moment that she had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with this complicated man who saw her as no one else ever had, and the knowledge filled her with equal parts joy and terror as the clock struck 8 and the grey morning stretched before them, with only 13 hours remaining before they would face Lady Catherine Sinclair, and whatever danger she represented in the darkness of London's dockside, with everything they had worked for and everything Clara had begun to hope for hanging in the balance. The evening of May 2nd, 1818, arrived with ominous clouds gathering over London at 6 o'clock, as Clara sat in her modest bedchamber and dressed for what might be the most dangerous night of her life. Choosing a dark grey gown that would blend into shadows and fastening her father's old pocket watch to her belt, with hands that trembled only slightly as she thought of the abandoned warehouse near the docks where she and Alexander would confront Lady Catherine Sinclair and whatever network of French agents she commanded, and when she descended the stairs at 7:30 to find Aunt Margaret waiting in the parlour with worried eyes, Clara felt her heart constrict at the lie she must tell about attending a late musicale with Harriet Langley, while knowing this deception might be the last conversation they ever had if the night went badly. She embraced her aunt with uncharacteristic intensity and promised to return before midnight, then stepped into the cool evening air where Alexander's unmarked carriage waited with Morrison at the reins, looking grim and capable in the way of men who had seen combat. And when she climbed inside to find Alexander already there, dressed in dark clothes with a pistol visible beneath his coat, the reality of what they were about to do crashed over her with terrifying clarity as he met her eyes and said quietly that it was not too late for her to stay behind, that he would understand if she chose safety over this dangerous gamble. Clara felt anger flash through her fear and replied with icy precision that they had been through this argument already, and she would not abandon their partnership now, when her knowledge of Lady Sinclair's writing patterns and coded methods was essential to identifying whatever contact the woman would meet. And besides, she had not spent 19 days building this investigation to miss its conclusion, and Alexander's jaw tightened, but he nodded and took her hand briefly in acknowledgement of her courage before releasing it as the carriage lurched forward through darkening streets toward the docks. They rode in tense silence, broken only by the clatter of wheels on cobblestones and the distant sounds of the river, and Clara watched London transform from fashionable squares to progressively rougher neighbourhoods until they reached the warehouse district, where fog rolled off the Thames and obscured the narrow streets in grey murk that smelled of salt and rot, and Morrison pulled the carriage to a stop 2 blocks from their destination and turned to say in his gruff military voice that he would position himself at the north entrance while His Grace and Miss Pembroke watched from the south, and if there was trouble, they should signal with the lantern, and he would come armed. They alighted into the damp evening at 8:15 and moved through the fog like ghosts toward the abandoned warehouse, and Clara felt Alexander's hand at her elbow, guiding her over treacherous cobblestones while her heart hammered against her ribs with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. And when they reached the building with its broken windows and sagging roof, he drew her into the shadows of a doorway across the street where they would have clear view of anyone entering, and pressed close beside her in the darkness. And she could feel the heat of his body and hear his steady breathing, and knew that whatever happened in the next hours would determine not just the success of their investigation, but the entire shape of her future. And at 8:30, as church bells tolled across the fog-bound city, they saw the first figure approaching through the mist, and recognized the distinctive silhouette of Lady Catherine Sinclair, arriving early to meet her French contact, and the trap they had so carefully constructed over weeks of dangerous work was finally springing closed. The evening of May 2nd, 1818, at 8:45, found Clara pressed into the shadows of the doorway, with Alexander's solid warmth at her back, and her breath coming in shallow, careful draws as they watched Lady Catherine Sinclair disappear into the abandoned warehouse. And for 8 agonizing minutes they waited in the fog-thick darkness, while Clara's mind raced through every possible outcome of the trap they had constructed. And then a second figure emerged from the mist, moving with the confident stride of someone who believed himself unobserved. A tall man in a dark coat, whose face remained hidden until he passed beneath the single flickering street lamp, and Clara recognized with shock the features of Lord Edmund Carstairs, whom they had investigated and cleared 3 days prior at the British Museum, which meant their entire analysis had been wrong, or else Lady Sinclair had more than one accomplice working in coordination. She felt Alexander tense behind her as he too recognized Carstairs, and his hand came to rest briefly on her shoulder in a gesture that might have been warning or reassurance, or both. And then Morrison appeared like a ghost from his position at the north entrance and made the hand signal they had arranged meaning. A third person had entered from the riverside of the building, and Clara understood with terrible clarity that they were facing not a simple exchange between 2 conspirators, but an entire network meeting in the darkness of this warehouse, while she and Alexander watched with inadequate planning and insufficient force to stop whatever was unfolding. Alexander leaned close enough that she could feel his breath against her ear, and whispered that she must go. Now back to the carriage and send Morrison's driver for the Foreign Office men stationed 6 blocks away at the pre-arranged location. And every fibre of Clara's being rebelled against leaving him here with only Morrison to face at least 3 trained agents who would certainly be armed and desperate if discovered. But she understood the logic of his command, and knew that without reinforcements they had no hope of capturing the conspirators, rather than merely scattering them to reform elsewhere. So she nodded once and felt his hand tighten on her shoulder for a heartbeat before releasing her, and she moved as silently as her grey gown and careful steps would allow, back through the fog toward where the carriage waited. She had covered perhaps 30 yards when she heard the sharp crack of a pistol shot from the warehouse, followed by men's voices raised in alarm, and her heart seemed to stop entirely as she stood frozen between the imperative to fetch help and the overwhelming terror that Alexander was in danger. And then a second shot rang out, and she heard Morrison's distinctive bellow of rage, and Clara abandoned all pretense of stealth and ran through the darkness toward the carriage, while behind her the sounds of struggle continued, and the man she loved with devastating completeness faced unknown danger in the service of protecting England from those who would sell her secrets to France. And when she reached the carriage at 9 o'clock exactly and gasped out her urgent message to the driver, who immediately whipped the horses into motion toward the Foreign Office men, Clara turned back toward the warehouse and saw flames beginning to lick at its ancient timbers, and knew with sick certainty that someone had set fire to destroy evidence and create chaos. And she understood that she could not wait for reinforcements, but must return to help Alexander and Morrison before the entire building became an inferno. So she gathered her skirts and ran back through the fog-shrouded streets toward the orange glow that was growing brighter with each passing second, while the church bells tolled 9, and the night that was supposed to end in triumph transformed into potential catastrophe. The flames leaped higher into the fog-shrouded sky as Clara reached the warehouse at 9:15 on that terrible night of May 2nd, 1818, and found the south entrance where she and Alexander had stood watching, now blocked by fire that roared with unnatural intensity, suggesting accelerants had been used, and she circled toward the riverside entrance where Morrison had positioned himself, while her lungs burned from running and her mind screamed with terror at what she might find inside. and when she rounded the corner, she nearly collided with Morrison himself, who was dragging an unconscious man in French military dress toward the dubious safety of the fog, while blood streamed from a cut above the butler's eye, and he barked at her to get back to safety, but she grabbed his arm and demanded to know where Alexander was, and Morrison's grim expression told her everything she feared as he said, "His Grace had gone deeper into the warehouse, pursuing Lady Sinclair, who had the documents they needed while Carstairs had attacked, and Morrison had been forced to choose between following his master and preventing this French agent from escaping. And Clara understood that Alexander was alone inside a burning building, facing at least 2 dangerous conspirators with no backup and no way out if the fire spread further. She released Morrison's arm and turned toward the river entrance before he could stop her, and the former soldier's protest followed her into the smoke, as she ducked through the doorway into hell itself, where flames consumed ancient timber and created pockets of searing heat alternating with corridors still passable. And she called Alexander's name while holding her sleeve across her mouth and nose, against smoke that choked and blinded, and she heard the crack of another pistol shot from somewhere above, on what must be the warehouse's 2nd level, and she found stairs that were not yet burning and climbed through smoke so thick she could barely see her own hands as they groped along a railing that grew hot beneath her touch. And at the top, she emerged into a vast, open space filled with abandoned crates and machinery, where through the smoke she saw 2 figures struggling near the far wall, while flames raced along the floor beneath them, consuming oil or spirits that created rivers of fire. And she recognized Alexander's dark coat, and saw that he was grappling with Lord Carstairs, while Lady Sinclair stood 10 feet away, holding a pistol trained on both men, with her face twisted into something feral and desperate, as she shouted that she would kill them both before surrendering the papers that would expose the entire French intelligence network in London. Clara's mind worked with the cold clarity that had always served her in her writing, as she assessed the scene and understood that Lady Sinclair had not yet noticed her arrival, and that Alexander was losing his struggle with Carstairs, who was younger and had desperation on his side. And without pausing to consider consequences or safety, Clara seized a length of chain that lay among the debris near the stairs and moved as quietly as the roaring flames would allow around the perimeter of the space toward Lady Sinclair's unguarded back. And she had covered perhaps half the distance when a falling beam crashed between them and sent up a shower of sparks that made Lady Sinclair spin toward the noise with her pistol raised, and their eyes met across 15 feet of burning warehouse, and Clara saw recognition and calculation flash across the other woman's face in the instant before the pistol swung toward her. And Alexander's voice roared her name with such anguish that time seemed to stop as Clara dove behind a crate and heard the shot splinter wood inches from where her head had been. The echo of Lady Sinclair's pistol shot still hung in the smoke-thick air at 9:30 on that catastrophic night of May 2nd, 1818, as Clara crouched behind the crate that had saved her life and heard Alexander's roar of anguish transform into a sound of pure fury, and through a gap in the burning debris, she saw him wrench free from Carstairs with a violence she had not imagined possible from a man who carried himself with such controlled elegance, and he drove his fist into the younger man's jaw with enough force to send Carstairs stumbling backward into a stack of crates that collapsed in a crash of splintering wood. And then Alexander was running toward Clara's position with his face a mask of terror and rage, while Lady Sinclair swung her pistol to track his movement, and Clara understood with crystalline clarity that the woman would shoot him rather than allow him to reach the cover where Clara hid. So she did the only thing her mind could conceive in that fragment of a second, and rose from behind the crate, with the chain still gripped in her hands, and threw it with all the strength her terror could provide, toward Lady Sinclair's head. The chain struck not the woman's skull as Clara had desperately hoped, but her outstretched arm holding the pistol, and the impact sent the weapon spinning away across the warehouse floor to disappear into smoke and shadow, and Lady Sinclair screamed with rage and pain as she clutched her injured wrist. And then Alexander reached Clara, and his hands were on her shoulders, and his eyes were wild as he demanded to know if she was hurt. While behind him, Carstairs was struggling to his feet, and the flames were consuming the floor between them and any possible exit. And Clara shook her head and gasped that she was unharmed, and tried to tell him they needed to retrieve the documents Lady Sinclair had been protecting. But her words were lost as a section of the roof collapsed 20 feet to their left and sent up a column of sparks and burning debris that forced them all to scramble backward from the suddenly intensified heat. Lady Sinclair had abandoned her injured arm and was now frantically searching the ground for her fallen pistol, while Carstairs moved toward her, calling that they must escape immediately before the entire building came down. And Clara saw the leather document case lying where Lady Sinclair had dropped it near an overturned barrel, perhaps 15 feet away through a corridor of flame that was growing narrower with each passing second. And she pointed and shouted to Alexander that they must get those papers before the fire consumed them. And she saw calculation and fear war across his features as he looked from her to the case to the advancing flames. And then he was pulling off his coat and soaking it in a puddle of water that had leaked from a broken pipe. And he wrapped the wet fabric around his left arm and told Clara, with a voice that brooked no argument, that she would stay exactly where she stood while he retrieved the case. And before she could protest, he was moving through the smoke toward the documents, while Lady Sinclair spotted him and screamed for Carstairs to stop the Duke, and Clara watched with her heart in her throat as the man she loved risked his life for evidence that might save England, but would certainly mean nothing if he died in the attempt. Alexander seized the document case at 23 minutes past 9 on that catastrophic night of May 2nd, 1818, and Clara watched through smoke and flame as Carstairs launched himself at the Duke with the desperation of a man who knew capture meant the noose, and the two men collided with brutal force that sent them both sprawling across the burning warehouse floor dangerously close to a river of flaming oil that spread like liquid death toward the walls. And Clara's scream was lost in the roar of fire as she saw Alexander roll away from Carstairs's grasping hands while clutching the leather case against his chest with his left arm still wrapped in the smoking remnants of his wet coat. And she understood in that moment of perfect terror that he would die before surrendering those documents, because too many had already perished for the secrets they contained, including his beloved sister Sophia. And something broke open inside Clara's chest as she watched him struggle to his feet while Carstairs drew a knife from his boot with murder plain on his soot-blackened face. She moved without conscious thought, her body acting on pure instinct as she ran toward the two men while Lady Sinclair's voice shrieked warnings that went unheeded, and Clara reached them just as Carstairs lunged with his blade extended toward Alexander's unprotected back, and she threw herself between them and felt the shocking impact as Carstairs crashed into her instead and sent them both tumbling sideways into a pile of debris while his knife skittered away across the floor into shadow and flame. And she heard Alexander roar her name with an anguish that would haunt her dreams if she lived to have dreams again. And then his hands were dragging her away from Carstairs, who was cursing and scrambling after his lost weapon, while the fire crept ever closer and the smoke grew so thick that breathing became a conscious act of will. Alexander pulled Clara behind an overturned cart and pressed the document case into her hands, and his eyes in the hellish firelight held such fierce emotion that she could not breathe for reasons that had nothing to do with smoke. And he said with terrible intensity that she must take these papers and run for the river entrance now while he held Carstairs off. And Clara shook her head violently and clutched his arm and told him she would not leave him to die in this inferno. And something passed between them in that moment that transcended words or reason or the terror of imminent death, and she saw in his face that he understood she meant what she said with every fibre of her being, and his hand came up to cup her cheek with a tenderness that seemed impossible amid the violence and chaos. And he said her name, just Clara, nothing more. But in his voice was everything he had not yet spoken, and everything she had not dared to hope. The moment shattered as a section of the warehouse's second level collapsed 30 feet away and sent a shock wave of heat that forced them both to cover their faces. And when Clara looked up again, through streaming eyes, she saw Lady Sinclair dragging the semi-conscious Carstairs toward what must be another exit hidden behind the flames, while Morrison's voice bellowed from somewhere below that the entire structure was coming down, and they had perhaps 2 minutes before the roof gave way completely. And Alexander seized Clara's hand and the document case together and began pulling her not toward the river entrance they had used, but toward the narrow gap where Lady Sinclair had disappeared because it was closer and their only chance. And they ran together through smoke so thick it was like drowning, while fire raged on all sides and timber groaned with the weight of its own destruction. And Clara's lungs burned and her vision swam, but she held tight to Alexander's hand and the documents that had cost so much and would save so many if only they could survive the next 90 seconds. And then they were through the gap and stumbling down a narrow service stairs that trembled beneath their feet, while behind them the warehouse gave one final tortured groan and began to collapse inward upon itself in an explosion of sparks and flame that lit the fog-shrouded Thames like daybreak. They emerged onto the cobblestones beside the Thames at 27 minutes past 9 on that catastrophic night of May 2nd, 1818, as the warehouse collapsed completely behind them in a roar of flame and destruction that sent embers spiraling into the fog-thick air like dying stars. And Clara fell to her knees on the rain-slicked stones, still clutching the leather document case to her chest, while her lungs heaved with the desperate effort to draw breath that was not smoke. And beside her, Alexander braced himself against the warehouse's outer wall, with his head bowed and his shoulders shaking with coughs that sounded as though they might tear him apart from the inside, and for perhaps 30 seconds there was nothing in the world but the sounds of their labored breathing and the inferno that raged behind the wall that had saved their lives by standing just long enough for them to escape. Clara felt Alexander's hand on her shoulder and looked up through streaming eyes to find him kneeling beside her with his face blackened by soot and a cut above his left eyebrow bleeding freely down his temple. And in his eyes was such fierce relief and lingering terror that she understood he had believed for those eternal seconds in the collapsing stairwell that they would both die. And she reached up with her free hand to touch his face and felt him turn into her palm with something like a sob, and she wanted to tell him that she was unharmed and that they had succeeded and that the documents were safe. But before she could form words, his arms were around her, and he was pulling her against his chest with a force that spoke of need beyond reason or propriety. And she dropped the document case and wrapped her arms around his neck and held him with equal desperation, while the fire roared behind them and the fog swirled cold against their overheated skin. They remained locked together for perhaps 20 seconds that felt both eternal and impossibly brief before Morrison's voice cut through the chaos, shouting that the Foreign Office men had arrived and that Lady Sinclair and Carstairs had been apprehended attempting to flee in a boat 50 yards downriver. And Clara felt Alexander's arms tighten around her for one more heartbeat before he slowly drew back and looked at her with such unguarded emotion that her breath caught for reasons that had nothing to do with smoke or exertion, and his hand came up to cup her face, and his thumb brushed across her cheekbone, smearing the soot there. And he said her name in a voice rough with smoke and feeling, and told her that when he had seen her throw herself between him and Carstairs' knife, he had understood with perfect clarity that his life would mean nothing if she died to save it. The words hung between them charged with everything unspoken, while around them men shouted orders, and the warehouse sent up fresh gouts of flame, and somewhere in the distance church bells began to ring the alarm, and Clara stared at Alexander and saw in his face the same terrifying recognition that was breaking open inside her own chest, that in 17 days they had somehow moved from adversaries to partners, to something far more dangerous than either investigation or attraction. And she opened her mouth to speak, though she had no idea what words could possibly encompass what she felt. But before she could make a sound, Morrison was beside them, with his military bearing somehow still intact, despite the soot covering his usually immaculate uniform. And he informed the Duke in tones that brooked no argument that they must move away from the building immediately as the fire brigade had arrived, and declared the structure in danger of taking down the neighboring warehouses if not contained. And Alexander nodded and climbed to his feet and extended his hand to Clara and pulled her up with careful strength. And she swayed slightly as the knight tilted around her and felt his arm come around her waist to steady her, while his other hand retrieved the document case from where it had fallen. And together they walked away from the inferno toward where a cluster of Foreign Office agents waited beside their horses, with Lady Sinclair and Carstairs bound and guarded between them. The Foreign Office men took custody of Lady Sinclair and Lord Carstairs at 34 minutes past 9 on that catastrophic night of May 2nd, 1818, as the fire brigade worked with grim determination to prevent the burning warehouse from spreading its destruction to the neighboring buildings along the Thames. And Clara watched with strange detachment as the woman who had caused so much death and suffering was lifted into a closed carriage with her hands bound and her fine silk gown torn and blackened by smoke. And Lady Sinclair's eyes found Clara's through the fog and firelight, and held them for one long moment that contained neither remorse nor fear, but only cold calculation. And Clara understood that this woman would continue plotting even from the confines of whatever cell awaited her, because treachery was not simply what she did, but what she was at the deepest level of her being. The senior Foreign Office agent, whose name Clara learned was Colonel Hartwick, approached Alexander with military bearing despite the late hour and chaos, and extended his hand in a gesture that spoke of professional respect between men who had both served crown and country in dangerous ways. And Clara heard him tell Alexander that the documents recovered from the burning warehouse contained intelligence that would save dozens of British agents currently operating in France and the Low Countries, and that His Majesty's government would be formally grateful for the Duke's service, though of course the entire matter must remain absolutely confidential. And Alexander nodded with the weary acceptance of a man who had never sought glory or recognition, but had simply done what duty demanded regardless of personal cost. And Colonel Hartwick's gaze shifted to Clara, and she saw in his eyes sharp assessment as he asked Alexander if the lady could be trusted with the sensitive nature of what she had witnessed. And before Clara could speak, Alexander's hand tightened on her waist, where his arm still steadied her, and he said with quiet authority that Miss Pembroke had risked her life to secure those documents and could be trusted with far more than mere confidentiality. And something in his tone made it clear the subject was not open for debate. And the colonel nodded and told them both that they would need to provide formal statements to the Foreign Office within the next 48 hours, but that for tonight they should see a physician and rest. And then he was turning away to oversee the departure of his prisoners, and Alexander was guiding Clara toward where Morrison waited beside the Duke's carriage, looking remarkably composed for a man who had just participated in the capture of foreign agents and the escape from a burning building. Clara's legs trembled as they walked, and she was grateful for Alexander's supporting arm, because the night seemed to be catching up with her body all at once, and she felt suddenly desperately weary in a way that went beyond mere physical exhaustion. And when they reached the carriage, Morrison opened the door and gave her a look of such genuine concern that she felt unexpected tears prick her eyes, because it had been so long since anyone beyond Aunt Margaret had cared whether she lived or died. and Alexander helped her into the carriage with careful attention and climbed in beside her, and Morrison closed the door, and the vehicle lurched into motion, carrying them away from the scene of flame and chaos toward whatever awaited them in the quieter darkness of Mayfair, and Clara leaned her head back against the velvet cushions and closed her burning eyes and felt Alexander take her hand in his, and neither of them spoke, because there were too many words between them now, and too few that could encompass everything that had changed in the space of 17 days. The carriage moved through the rain-slicked streets of Mayfair at 14 minutes past 10 on that catastrophic night of May 2nd, 1818, with its lamps casting wavering pools of golden light across the cobblestones, while inside Clara sat in silence beside Alexander, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle over her like a physical thing, and she was acutely aware of his hand still holding hers, and the warmth of his body beside her on the velvet seat, and the way her borrowed greatcoat carried the scent of sandalwood and smoke that seemed to surround him like an atmosphere. And she knew she should release his hand and move a proper distance away and say something light or practical to break the dangerous intimacy that had grown between them in the warehouse and the carriage ride that followed. But she found herself unable to do any of those things, because the truth was that she did not want to let go of his hand or move away or pretend that nothing had changed when everything had changed so completely that she could barely recognize the person she had been 17 days ago when she had sat in Lady Harrington's ballroom, believing herself invulnerable and alone by choice rather than by circumstance. The carriage swayed around a corner, and Clara felt Alexander's thumb move gently across her knuckles in a gesture so tender that it made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion, and she turned her head to look at him through the dim lamplight, and found him already watching her with an expression that combined exhaustion and relief, and something deeper that made her heart beat faster despite her body's weariness. And she saw him open his mouth as though to speak, but then close it again, as if he had thought better of whatever words he had been about to offer, and the silence stretched between them, charged with everything unspoken, until Clara could bear it no longer, and she said in a voice roughened by smoke that she supposed he would be glad to be rid of her now that the investigation was concluded and she had served her purpose, and even as the words left her mouth, she regretted them because they sounded bitter and defensive, when what she had meant was that she could not imagine returning to her former life, now that she had experienced what it felt like to be truly seen by another person and valued for her mind rather than judged for her circumstances. Alexander's hand tightened on hers with sudden force, and he said her name in a tone that held both reproach and something fiercer. And then he was telling her that if she believed he had spent these 17 days thinking of her merely as a useful tool in his investigation, then she understood nothing of what had passed between them, or of what he felt, and Clara stared at him with her breath caught in her chest as he continued speaking with unusual urgency, saying that he had tried to maintain professional distance and had told himself repeatedly that the mission must take precedence over personal feeling, but that every hour spent in her company had made that resolution more impossible until he had reached the point where keeping her safe had become more important to him than catching traitors or serving Crown or maintaining the careful control he had practiced since Sophia's death. And Clara felt tears sting her smoke-damaged eyes as she heard in his words the echo of her own struggle and her own surrender to feelings she had never expected to experience. The carriage drew to a stop outside her modest townhouse at 23 minutes past 10, and Morrison opened the door, letting in a gust of cool night air that carried the scent of rain and spring flowers, and Clara realized with sudden panic that this moment was ending, and she did not know when she would see Alexander again, or whether the connection forged in danger and investigation could survive in the ordinary light of day.